Before we begin, a word. Every voice you're about to hear could belong to a real person, and the next one could be yours. Claim a part and read it aloud at Footnotes and Folly. Click. Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is Book 17, Part 3. Herod is dead, but the poison in the house has outlived him. We open with the people grieving still for Matthias and the youths who were burned gathering in the temple to demand that the men who counselled that cruelty be punished. Archelaus, who means to be king and is waiting only on Caesar's word, first coaxes them, then loses patience, and sends in his soldiers, and the feast of unleavened bread ends with 3,000 dead among the sacrifices. Then the family scatters to Rome, every one of them Archelaus to claim the throne, his brother Antipas to snatch it, Salome and the rest to watch and to meddle, and they lay the quarrel of Herod's will at the feet of Augustus Caesar. And behind them comes a very different embassy, 50 men of the nation, backed by 8,000 of the Jews of Rome, who ask Caesar not for a better Herod, but for no Herod at all, to be allowed to live under their own law and Rome's governors. Let us go on.
At the same time, some of the Jews gathered because they wanted political change. They mourned for Matthias, and for the men Herod had killed with him, the men condemned for tearing down the golden eagle. No public funeral mourning had been paid to them before, because everyone had feared Herod. Now the people raised a loud outcry and lamented them, and they also spoke bitterly against the king, as though that could ease the suffering of the dead. They assembled and asked Archelaus to avenge them by punishing those whom Herod had honored. Above all, they demanded that he remove the high priest appointed by Herod and choose a man more acceptable to the law and purer in character to serve in that office. Archelaus granted this, though he was deeply offended by their pressure, because he intended to go at once to Rome to learn Caesar's decision about him. Even so, he sent the general of his forces to persuade them. The general was to tell them that the death inflicted on their friends had been lawful, and that their requests had gone so far as to injure Archelaus himself. He was also to explain that this was not the proper time for such petitions, but a time for unity until Archelaus should be confirmed in the government by Caesar's consent and returned to them. Then, he said, Archelaus would consult with them all about the purpose of their petitions. For the present they ought to remain quiet, so that they would not appear to be seditious. After the king had laid out these instructions and told his general what to say, he sent him to the people. But they shouted him down, would not allow him to speak, and put his life in danger. They did the same to any others who dared say anything openly that might bring them back to sober judgment and stop them from continuing as they were. They cared more about getting everything they wanted than about obeying their rulers. They thought it unbearable that, while Herod was alive, they had lost those dearest to them, and now that he was dead they still could not have the offenders punished. So they pushed their plans forward violently. Whatever pleased them they considered lawful and right. They did not understand the dangers they were bringing on themselves, and even when they suspected such dangers, their present pleasure in punishing those they regarded as enemies outweighed every other concern. Archelaus sent many people to speak to them, but they treated these men not as messengers sent by him, but as private persons who had come on their own to calm their anger, and they would not let any one of them speak. The sedition was driven by men in a fierce passion, and it was plain that they were moving further into rebellion as the crowd rushed to join them. Then the feast of unleavened bread approached, the feast appointed at this time for the Jews by the law of their fathers. It is called the Passover, and is kept as a memorial of their deliverance from Egypt. At this feast they offer sacrifices with great eagerness, and they are required to kill more sacrifices than at any other festival. An innumerable multitude came to Jerusalem from the country, and even from beyond its borders, to worship God. The seditious men mourned Judas and Matthias, those teachers of the laws, and stayed together in the temple. They had plenty of food, because these rebels were not ashamed to beg for it. Archelaus feared that some terrible disaster would arise from their madness, so he sent a regiment of armed men with a captain of 1,000 to suppress the violent efforts of the rebels before the whole multitude caught the same madness. He ordered them to bring to him any men they found more openly seditious than the rest and more active in stirring up disorder. But the men who were rioting on account of those teachers of the law stirred up the people with noise and shouting, urging them on in their plans. They attacked the soldiers, came up to them, and stoned most of them. Some escaped wounded, including their captain. After doing this, the rebels returned to the sacrifices they already had in their hands. Archelaus then decided that there was no way to preserve the whole government except by destroying those who had made this attack on it. He sent the entire army against them, and sent the horsemen to keep those camped outside the temple from helping those inside it. The horsemen were also to kill anyone who escaped the foot soldiers and thought he had reached safety. They killed 3,000 men, while the rest fled to the nearby mountains. Archelaus then ordered a proclamation to be made to all of them, telling them to go back to their own homes. So they left, abandoning the festival out of fear that something worse would follow, though they had acted so boldly because of their lack of instruction. After this, Archelaus went down to the sea with his mother. He took with him Nicolaus, Ptolemy, and many other friends, and left his brother Philip as governor over everything belonging both to his own family and to the public. Salome, Herod's sister, also went with him, taking her children with her, and many of her relatives accompanied her. They claimed that they were going to help Archelaus obtain the kingdom, but in reality they meant to oppose him, especially by loudly accusing him of what he had done in the temple. Sabinus, Caesar's steward for Syrian affairs, was hurrying into Judea to secure Herod's property when he met Archelaus at Caesarea. At that time Varus, the president of Syria, arrived and restrained Sabinus from interfering with those matters. Varus had come because Archelaus had sent for him through Ptolemy. Out of regard for Varus, Sabinus neither seized any of the Jewish castles nor sealed up the treasures in them, but allowed Archelaus to keep them until Caesar should declare his decision. On this promise, Sabinus remained at Caesarea. But after Archelaus had sailed for Rome and Varus had gone back to Antioch, Sabinus went to Jerusalem and seized the king's palace. He also summoned the keepers of the garrisons and all those who had charge of Herod's property, and publicly announced that he would require them to give an account of what they held. He arranged the castles as he pleased. But those who guarded them did not neglect the orders Archelaus had given them. They continued to keep everything as they had been commanded, and their excuse was that they were keeping it all for Caesar. At the same time, Antipas, another son of Herod, sailed to Rome to try to obtain the government. Salome had encouraged him with promises that he would receive it, saying that he was a much more honorable and suitable man than Archelaus for such authority. She argued that Herod, in his earlier will, had judged Antipas the worthiest person to be made king, and that this earlier will ought to be considered more valid than the later one. Antipas took his mother with him, along with Ptolemy, the brother of Nicolaus. Ptolemy had been one of Herod's most honored friends, and was now eager to support Antipas. But the person who encouraged Antipas most of all to seek the kingdom was Irenaeus the orator, a man trusted with the affairs of the kingdom because of his reputation for good judgment. Through his influence, Antipas refused to yield when some advised him to submit to Archelaus as his elder brother and as the man named king in their father's last will. When Antipas arrived in Rome, all his relatives went over to his side, not because they loved him, but because they hated Archelaus. In truth, what they wanted most was to gain their liberty and be placed under a Roman governor. But if that could not be achieved because the opposition was too strong, they thought Antipas was preferable to Archelaus, and so they joined him in trying to secure the kingdom for him. Sabinus also wrote letters accusing Archelaus to Caesar. Archelaus had already sent Caesar his documents, in which he argued for his right to the kingdom. He included his father's will, the accounts of Herod's money, and Ptolemy, who brought Herod's seal. Then he waited for the outcome. But when Caesar had read these papers, together with the letters from Varus and Sabinus, the accounts of the money, and the reports of the kingdom's yearly revenues, and when he learned that Antipas had also sent letters claiming the kingdom, he summoned his friends to hear their opinions. With them was Caius, the son of Agrippa, and of Caesar's daughter Julia, whom Caesar had adopted. Caesar brought Caius in, seated him first among them, and invited anyone who wished to speak to give his judgment on the matters before them. It is ridiculous for Archelaus now to ask that the kingdom be given to him, since in fact he had already taken power over it for himself before Caesar granted it to him. Look at the bold actions he took when he destroyed so many people at the Jewish festival. If those men had acted unjustly, their punishment should have been left to those who were outside the country, but had the authority to punish them. It should not have been carried out by a man who, if he claimed to be king, wronged Caesar by seizing that authority before Caesar had decided the matter, and if he admitted that he was only a private person, his case was even worse. A man who seeks the kingdom cannot expect to receive a power that he has already taken away from Caesar by using it himself. Archelaus changed the commanders in the army, sat beforehand on the royal throne, and decided lawsuits, doing everything as if he were already king. He made concessions to those who petitioned him on public business, and did things no greater than he could have done if Caesar had already settled him firmly in the kingdom. He released the prisoners who were in the hippodrome, and did many other things that were either certainly done by him, or were believed to have been done. They could easily be believed, because they were just the kinds of things young men do when, out of a desire to rule, they seize government too soon. He also neglected the mourning due at his father's funeral and held merry gatherings on the very night his father died. From that the crowd took its opportunity to raise a disturbance. Archelaus repaid his dead father in this way, after Herod had given him such benefits and left him such great things, pretending by day to weep for him like an actor on a stage, but every night rejoicing because he had gained the government. Then he will show himself the same toward Caesar, if Caesar gives him the kingdom, as he has already shown himself toward his father. He had dancing and singing as though an enemy had fallen, not as though a man so closely related to him and so great a benefactor had been carried to his funeral. The greatest crime of all is that Archelaus has come before Caesar to obtain the government by Caesar's grant, while he has already acted in everything as though Caesar, who rules all, had firmly established him in that government. Worst of all was the slaughter around the temple, and the impiety of doing it during the festival. Those people were killed like sacrifices themselves, some of them foreigners and others people of their own country, until the temple was full of dead bodies. All this was done not by a foreigner, but by one who pretended to have the lawful title of king, so that he might complete the wicked tyranny to which his nature drives him, and which all men hate. For this reason his father, while he was of sound mind, never so much as dreamed of making him his successor in the kingdom, because he knew his character. In his earlier and more authentic will, Herod appointed his rival Antipas to succeed him. Archelaus was called by his father to that dignity only when Herod was dying in both body and mind. Antipas was called when Herod's judgment was at its ripest, and when his body was strong enough for him to manage his own affairs. Even if his father had formerly held the same opinion of Archelaus that he later showed, Archelaus has now given a sufficient example of what sort of king he is likely to be. While still a private person, he has in effect deprived Caesar of his rightful power to dispose of the kingdom, and he did not refrain from making a terrible slaughter of his fellow citizens in the temple. When Antipater, Salom's son, had made this speech, he supported what he had said by producing many witnesses from among Archelaus's own relatives, and then he ended his plea. After him, Nicolaus rose to speak in defense of Archelaus. What happened at the temple should be blamed more on the intentions of those who were killed than on the authority of Archelaus. People who cause such events are wicked not only because of the injuries they commit themselves, but also because they force sober-minded men to avenge themselves upon them. It is clear that what those men did in opposition was done in appearance against Archelaus, but in reality against Caesar himself. In an injurious manner, they attacked and killed the men sent by Archelaus, men who had come only to stop their actions. They showed no regard either for God or for the festival. Yet Antipater is not ashamed to defend them, whether because he indulges his enmity against Archelaus or because he hates virtue and justice. Those who begin such tumults, and are the first to undertake such unrighteous actions, are the very men who force those who punish them to take up arms, even against their will. In effect, Antipater attributes the rest of what happened to all those who advised the accusers, for nothing here charged as injustice was done except what came from them as its authors. These actions are not evil in themselves, they are only represented that way in order to harm Archelaus. This is how strongly these men are inclined to injure a man who is their own kinsman, who was their father's benefactor, who is closely acquainted with them, and who has always lived in friendship with them. As for this will, it was made by the king when he was of sound mind, and therefore it ought to carry more authority than his earlier will. It should do so especially because Caesar is left in it as the judge and disposer of everything it contains. Caesar certainly will not imitate the unjust conduct of these men. During Herod's whole life, they shared power with him on every occasion, and yet they now zealously try to injure his decision, while they themselves have not shown the same regard for their kinsman that Archelaus has shown. Caesar will therefore not annul the will of a man whom he entirely supported, his friend and ally, nor will he reject what has been entrusted to him to ratify. Caesar's virtuous and upright character, known and undisputed throughout the whole inhabited world, will not imitate these men's wickedness by condemning a king as mad and out of his mind when he has left the succession to a good son, one who flees for refuge to Caesar's upright judgment. Nor could Herod have been mistaken at any time in his judgment about his successor, since he showed so much prudence as to submit everything to Caesar's decision. Nicolaus had presented these arguments to Caesar, he ended his speech. Caesar then showed great kindness to Archelaus. When Archelaus had thrown himself down at Caesar's feet, Caesar raised him up and said that he clearly deserved the kingdom. He soon made it plain that he had been moved so far in Archelaus's favor that he would act only according to his father's will, and according to what would be best for Archelaus. Still, though he encouraged Archelaus to trust him, Caesar did not make a final decision. After the assembly broke up, he considered privately whether he should confirm the whole kingdom to Archelaus, or divide it among all of Herod's descendants, since all of them needed a great deal of support if they were to maintain themselves. Before these matters could be settled, Malthus, the mother of Archelaus, became ill and died. Letters also came from Varus, the governor of Syria, informing Caesar that the Jews had revolted. After Archelaus had sailed away, the whole nation fell into disorder. Since Varus was present in the region, he punished the leaders of the disturbance. After he had largely restrained them from this serious sedition, he traveled to Antioch, leading 1 legion of his army at Jerusalem to keep the Jews quiet, since they were now very eager for change. Even this did not end the sedition. After Varus left, Sabinus, Caesar's procurator, stayed behind and treated the Jews harshly. He relied on the troops that had been left there, believing that their numbers would protect him. He used them as armed guards, and by this means oppressed the Jews and disturbed them so greatly that they finally rebelled. He used force to seize the citadels, and he pushed eagerly to search for the king's money so that he could take it by force, driven by his greed and extraordinary covetousness. When Pentecost approached, a festival of ours named from the custom of our forefathers, many tens of thousands of men gathered. They did not come only to celebrate the festival, but also because they were angry at the madness of Sabinus and at the wrongs he had done them. There were many Galileans, many Idumeans, many men from Jericho, and others who had crossed the river Jordan and lived in those regions. This whole multitude joined with the rest, and they were more eager than the others to attack Sabinus and take revenge on him. They divided themselves into 3 groups and encamped in different places. Some seized the hippodrome. Of the other 2 groups, one took position from the northern part of the temple to the southern part on the eastern side. The third held the western part of the city, where the king's palace was. Their whole purpose was to besiege the Romans and surround them on every side. Sabinus was afraid of their numbers and their determination. These men cared little for their lives, and strongly desired not to be defeated, believing it a mark of strength to overcome their enemies. Sabinus immediately sent a letter to Varus, and, as was his custom, pressed him urgently and begged him to come quickly to his aid. He said the forces Varus had left were in immediate danger, and would probably soon be captured and cut to pieces. Sabinus himself went up to the highest tower of the fortress Phasaelus, which had been built in honor of Phasaelus, King Herod's brother, and had received that name after the Parthians brought Phasaelus to his death. From there Sabinus gave the Romans a signal to attack the Jews, though he himself did not dare even to come down to his friends. He thought others should expose themselves first and die, because of his avarice. The Romans nevertheless dared to make a sortie from their position, and a terrible battle followed. Although the Romans defeated their opponents, the Jews did not lose courage, even when they saw the dreadful slaughter among them. Instead, they went around and climbed onto the cloisters that surrounded the outer court of the temple. There the fight continued fiercely. They threw stones at the Romans, partly by hand and partly with slings, since they were well practiced in such exercises. All the archers, drawn up in order, also did great harm to the Romans, because they used their hands skillfully from higher ground. The Romans were at a complete loss. When they tried to shoot arrows upward against the Jews, their arrows could not reach them, so the Jews easily had the advantage over their enemies. This kind of fighting lasted a long time, until the Romans, greatly distressed by what was happening, secretly set fire to the cloisters, so that those who had climbed onto them did not notice. The fire, fed by much combustible material, immediately caught the roof of the cloisters. The wood was full of pitch and wax, and the gold on it had been laid with wax, so it quickly yielded to the flames. Those vast works, which had been of the highest value and honor, were utterly destroyed. At the same time, the men on the roof unexpectedly perished. As the roof collapsed, some fell with it, while others were killed by the enemies who surrounded them. Many more, despairing of escape and stunned by the misery around them, either threw themselves into the fire or fell on their own swords, ending their suffering in that way. Those who retreated by the same route they had used to climb up, and so escaped the fire, were all killed by the Romans. They were unarmed, their courage failed them, and their earlier fury could no longer help them because they had no armor. Of all those who had gone up onto the roof, not one escaped. The Romans also rushed through the fire wherever there was room to pass, and seized the treasure where the sacred money was kept. A large part of it was stolen by the soldiers, and Sabinus openly took 400 talents. The Jews were deeply grieved by this disaster, both because their friends had fallen in the battle, and because the money dedicated to God in the temple had been plundered. Accordingly, the body of Jews that remained most united and was the most warlike surrounded the palace. They threatened to set it on fire and kill everyone inside. Still, they ordered those inside to come out at once, and promised that if they did so, they would not harm them, nor even Sabinus. At that time most of the king's troops deserted and joined the Jews. Rufus and Gratus, however, went over to the Romans with 3,000 of the most warlike men from Herod's army, men of active bodies. A band of horsemen under the command of Rufus also went over to the Romans. Even so, the Jews continued the siege. They dug mines under the palace walls and begged those who had gone over to the other side not to stand in their way, since they now had such a good opportunity to recover their country's ancient liberty. Sabinus truly wanted to leave with his soldiers, but he could not trust himself to the enemy, because of the harm he had already done them. He took their great, supposed mildness as a reason not to accept their offer. Since he expected Varus to come, he continued to endure the siege.
And there we will pause, with the whole matter hanging in the marble quiet of Caesar's council chamber, a kingdom's fate, and a family's, and a nation's plea, all waiting on the word of one tired old man in Rome. But we have left something smouldering back in Judea, and it will not wait for Caesar's leisure. Next time, in Part 4, the land itself rises. With no king and no order, old soldiers and shepherds and a slave of Herod's put crowns on their own heads. Varus marches down from Syria with 2 legions and bounds his way to Jerusalem, and 2,000 men end on Roman crosses. Then Caesar gives his judgment on the will, and divides the realm. A dead prince walks again in the person of an impostor, and the reign of Archelaus runs out its short, hard course. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly. One last thing before you go. There is a part on our stage still wanting a voice, and it may as well be yours. Come and read for us at footnotesandfolly.click, and be in the next telling rather than only watching it. And before the lamp goes out, a small request. If something tonight taught you, or surprised you, or simply delighted you, do leave a comment and tell me what it was. And if there's a work, an author, or tale you should like me to take up next, set it down there as well. I read every one, and many an episode has begun its life as a viewer's suggestion. Until next time.